This is not a book about cults and telling everybody they have to get out and go back into conventional society. This is not about that. This is really about inner work and becoming aware of what you're giving away in relation to experts or mentors or guides. I mentioned analysts because you told me, Gloria, that there were some analysts. That can happen too. And in the professional magazines for psychologists and MFTs, we see, in every magazine, all these people who are acting out money and sex in their clinical work. So this is not just in one arena, politics or religion. This is human nature.
Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Cuello, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness, including very important shadow work, as the key to individual growth and global healing. In addition to our online presentations with guest speakers, we also offer classes and study groups, and everything is online ever since 2020. And we draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science, consciousness, spirituality, and philosophy. We are now in our 20th year. We started in 2003 at our center in Boulder, Colorado. However, in 2020, we went fully virtual, and we began recording our presentations on Zoom, which has been just such a treasure trove. We currently have a little over 100, maybe 110 or so, something like that, video recordings, and they are viewable through our website, caritascenter.org, and on our YouTube channel, Caritas Consciousness Project. As a nonprofit organization, we do rely on the support of our members and donors to keep our program going. So if you'd like to support this program, you can make a donation on any page of our website or become a member on our membership page. And now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker. 1 second. Yeah. Okay, so Connie Zweig. I hope I'm saying that right. Connie Zweig.
Yes.
Okay, Ph.D. is a retired therapist and co-author of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow. Her award-winning book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends her work on the shadow into midlife and beyond, and explores aging as a spiritual practice. That's the next book I'm gonna get. It won the 2022 Gold COVR Award, the 2022 Gold Nautilus Award, the 2021 American Book Fest Award, and the 2021 Best Indie Book Award for Best Inspirational Nonfiction. Her new book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, here we are. It's a wonderful book. The Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening is the subtitle. And this book is available now. Connie has been doing contemplative practices for more than 50 years. She's a wife, stepmother, and grandmother. After all these roles, she's practicing the shift from role to soul. And her website is conniezweig.com. Welcome, Connie. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Really, really glad to be here. And thank you, all of you ladies, for showing up. Kind of excited that we have a women's group tonight. That's really nice. And Robin, you held up my book. That was really supportive. Thank you. So what I want to do is start with a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to go through it rather quickly so that we have time together to have a conversation. And also, because you don't need to be concerned about getting everything down on paper. You certainly can have paper and pen or your device available if you're a note taker like me. But if not, don't worry about it because, the material is in the book. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and then in a little while, I'm going to, there are several moments in the presentation that are self-reflection, where I'll just give you a moment to see what comes up inside of you and take some notes. And other than that, we'll have our exchange at the end, okay? Okay. You can see that, Gloria?
Yes.
Okay. So, I'm sure because you're here tonight at Caritas that some of you have spiritual experience and practices and communities. And so you probably know that in every tradition, the saints and the poets speak about the soul's search for the beloved, the seeker's yearning for the divine. And this holy longing is a secret feeling with many disguises that leads us to pursue a higher union in spiritual practice, religious discipleship, and even romantic embrace. It guides us to timeless wisdom and transcendent experiences. But it also can go awry when we project the divine onto a teacher, priest, guru, rabbi, or roshi, who's all too human, who has unhealed wounds, undeveloped empathy, and even authoritarian tendencies. In effect, a woman or man who has a shadow. And if he or she abuses power, whether the abuse is sexual, financial, or emotional, we feel a shock of betrayal. Our innocence is lost and our faith is shaken. In our time, we've witnessed many teachers of Buddhism, Hinduism, Hasidism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestant groups act out their shadows in destructive ways, leaving their followers traumatized. And some of you may have experienced this firsthand, but you may not have had the wisdom and the tools of spiritual shadow work to help you work through these betrayals and to rekindle the flame of longing in your soul. Daily accounts of the eruption of human shadow bombard us today in the social and political arenas, with darkness blocking out the light, just as in an eclipse. Tonight, our focus is going to move from the headlines to the eruption of human shadow in the spiritual or religious context. And let me point out, I'm not discussing metaphysics. I'm applying depth psychology to the spiritual search. So we've lived through a tidal wave of Catholic priest childhood sexual abuse in the 1980s, and that continues today in new revelations and in payouts by the church. We live through social media and published reports of teachers in every tradition who claim the highest reaches of human consciousness and yet act out sexual assault, emotional abuse, financial coercion. And yet somehow we continue to imagine a spiritual life without an encounter with human darkness. Why do we continue to be shocked and betrayed when it erupts? The Me Too movement went viral in 2017 to raise awareness of sexual violence in the workplace, military, universities, and other secular settings. But the movement also helped survivors in spiritual communities to connect online, empower each other, and encourage whistleblowers to out their leaders. Some all-powerful teachers could no longer control the narratives in their isolated kingdoms. Many of them fled the country or lost legal battles. In chapter 5 of the new book, I tell the tales of dozens of teachers who fell from grace. Osho, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Richard Baker Roshi, Bikram of Hot Yoga, Sogyal Rinpoche, Vishwananda, Lama Norla, Swami Muktananda, and Guru Mai, Yogi Bhajan, Muji, Bentino Massaro, Noah Levine, Adi Da, Andrew Cohen, and more. Priests and rabbis too. Even this month, I noticed that the Southern Baptist Convention reverted to sexist policy, removing female leaders from the community. The stories of meeting the shadow on the spiritual path can lead to this darkness overcoming the light. When a group of Tibetan Buddhist survivors of abuse provided a document of allegations to the Dalai Lama, it was called Me Too Guru. It's evident from my research that we need a spiritual justice movement. But only 13 states have penal statutes that support the criminal prosecution of clergy for sex with a congregant. So let's explore a bit how this can happen. From childhood through late life, many people long for God, spirit, transcendence, a sense of something greater. When you imagine God, what do you see? A stern, bearded male perched on a throne with angels circling his head? A beatific Madonna with an innocent child at her breast? A black four-armed goddess dancing on a corpse? Indra's net as it weaves through and interconnects all living things? The letters of a holy name, a colorful mandala, a sacred mountain. Each religion comes with its own images of God. In several Eastern traditions, these are objects of contemplation, evoking spiritual qualities in the aspirant. The eminent psychiatrist Carl Jung explored the God image in myth and in the psyches of his patients. And for me, this God image is the hidden object of desire, typically hidden in the unconscious shadow, but pointing towards something beyond ego and arousing our holy longing. When we find a sacred teacher or guide who evokes our longing, our image of God leaps out of our inner world onto an idealized human being. And we're filled with exalted feelings of devotion in the presence of our ideal. In our psyches, the teacher, priest, guru, rabbi, roshi, lama, sheikh, or analyst has realized in human form the ideal other living in the student, the image of the complete or self-realized human being. And so in the inner world of the student, the teacher carries the student's own highest authority, the parent who won't fail him, the godlike human whose attributes she strives to emulate. And for the student to recognize the teacher as such, there must be a match between the inner image and the outer person. The arrow of projection hits the target, and the student feels a fit. I can remember at 19 years old, for seeing my first meditation teacher, walking into the hall and seeing him, long hair and beard, in a white dhoti and Indian robe, sitting on a dais. And I can remember kind of swooning and saying to myself, that's who I'm going to be. I'm going to be a yogi. So Carl Jung called this an archetypal projection, distinct from a personal parental projection. He uncovered through a patient's dream that this patient was turning him into a god. And like her, many of us are unconsciously attributing godlike status to spiritual teachers. And once activated, this projection holds a promise and a duty, an inspiration and a burden. On the flip side, the teacher basks in the aspiration, in the admiration and devotion of the student. In some cases, teachers unconsciously come to emotionally depend on this adoration like food. And so they behave in ways that exact obedience from their followers. With a lack of moral development, they act out their shadows in destructive ways. So what would lead us? Many of us are independent, highly developed adults. So what would lead us to endow another human being with this authority? Our tender longings activate vulnerable feelings of childlike devotion. Maybe an unconscious longing to merge with a powerful figure for protection against feelings of powerlessness or abandonment. And so we're susceptible to the vagaries of human authorities who appear to be benign. Freudians tell us that this is only our personal history, and our longing for the almighty other refers to a parent. But we know from Carl Jung that archetypal projection is hidden beneath and behind the parental projection. So let me step back and be sure that we all share our understanding of projection. So through this process, the shadow or the unconscious mind expels both positive and negative traits by attributing them to other people and disowning them in ourselves. Each of us carries this archer's quiver on our backs, and every so often an arrow shoots out unpredictably. That person is so stupid, or that person is so wise and compassionate. And so maybe we say something nasty, or maybe we fall in love. And in this case, we may begin to surrender to a teacher. And our early needs to feel special, to be seen, to keep secrets, to feel belonging, are all at play. Some of us unconsciously seek teachers like our parents, and others seek those who are different. Some people meet teachers who seem to be so different from their parents that that's what's appealing to them. But later, when the shadow erupts, they discover he or she is a lot like a parent. For instance, a teacher may appear to be gentle and compassionate, but when he's angry, he becomes a critical know-it-all, just like a woman's father. Or when he begins to gain wealth, he becomes a materialistic consumer, just like her family. Or when his sexuality is not processed, he begins to seduce women with promises of enlightenment, urging them to keep his secret, just like family secrets. It's an unconscious match. The shadow in each of them is unconsciously recreating a parent-child relationship, bringing an opportunity for spiritual shadow work. So what happens when the projection rattles? Have you experienced a religious abuse of power, sexual coercion, financial coercion, or were you a witness to the abuse of others? Our clergy and teachers are human and not perfect. As a teacher's ego becomes inflated with success, surrounded by adoring followers and the props of a lineage, he or she may come to feel the right to sit on a golden throne and increase his authority without limits. Using power to serve the ego's agenda, the teacher's danger grows. Soon he does not have power, power has him. It becomes an unconscious complex, acted out on the stage of the most sacred arena of life. And teachers or clergy may subject their followers to verbal abuse, physical violence, emotional control, withholding of love and approval, threats of punishment and expulsion. And power and sex go hand in hand. An incursion may be careless or aggressive, subtle or traumatic, but many teachers and clergy use sex to express power, intimidate others, and feed their own emptiness. In particular, a culture's deeply ingrained traditions of misogyny and objectification may engender in male teachers and clergy a shadow that allows them to use women, men, girls, or boys as objects for their own gratification. The cases of the Me Too movement reposed questions about power and gender. Who has the power and who doesn't? Who has consent? Can someone consent if her career, education, mental health, financial well-being, or spiritual well-being is controlled by the person who wants sex? Can she consent if she's told she'll be excommunicated, her family will go to hell, her karma will be damaged for lifetimes if she refuses? The power differential between religious clergy and their acolytes make consent questionable. And like sex, money can become the ego's tool. It's the root of all evil. It's the grail we seek. It carries the projection of divine energies and can be worshipped like a false god in the form of a sleek private jet, a shiny Rolls Royce, a golden throne. Financial coercion can be covert, beginning with tithing, and lead to overt abuse, like when a teacher demands access to a student's income or inheritance. The reports of so many teachers living lifestyles of excess, in contrast to their teachings, and in contrast to those who serve them, are deeply disheartening. Some of you may have seen the recent movie with Jessica Chastain about Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. So, there was a period where the televangelists were all over the screen, and we were seeing a lot of this. And some teachers claim that salvation or enlightenment lies in giving them money or sex. They promise that these gifts will carry their followers to heaven or to higher consciousness. So when examined together, the incidents of spiritual abuse reveal patterns across all the denominations. And this was one of the discoveries that kind of blew my mind as I was researching the book. We invest this relationship with our hearts and minds. We entrust it with our souls. And so we're reluctant to find fault. And we deny violations of trust because of that investment. If the relationship fails, it invalidates our judgment and the vision to which we devoted our lives. So denial is epidemic. Although a group's teachings and practices may be valuable, its organizational structures may be authoritarian, or its members' behaviors may be compulsive and cult-like. And they often resemble the coping strategies that we see in alcoholic homes, alcoholic families. So let me just read this quickly for you. A priest or teacher exploits others for his or her own narcissistic needs. The transgressions are often boundary violations. The member chosen for abuse is made to feel special. Others enable the abusive behavior. Members deny their feelings, their doubts, and their intuition. They want to maintain the projection at all cost. They rationalize hurtful behavior, and shameful secrets glue the system together. Members are threatened with retaliation for disclosure or wishing to leave. So, what are the consequences of religious betrayal or trauma or abuse? At some point, the projection pops. Denial breaks down. Rationalization no longer holds. And the defenses against the truth of the abuse collapse. Following the shock that believers feel after meeting spiritual shadow, many suffer the symptoms of PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, irritability, self-destructive behavior, guilt, shame. Some of them succumb to rage, blaming the church or sangha, teacher, God, or themselves. The feelings of betrayed trust lead them to distrust others. Other people succumb to depression. They lose their community, their purpose, and the meaning that glued their life together. They regret the time that was lost. They feel guilty about lies and deceptions they colluded with, and ashamed for having been duped. They may struggle with loneliness, sexuality, finances, and other delayed developmental issues. And they fear retaliation. These traumatic consequences can last decades. So I'm going to move now into recovery and how do we use depth psychology and what I call shadow work in order to begin the healing process. So, first of all, communal spiritual shadow work. In the 1990s, Yogi Amrit Desai, an adept in Kundalini practice, founder of Kripalu Yoga Ashram, some of you may have heard of it, taught that sex would slow students' progress to awakening, and celibacy would enhance spiritual energy. When a woman disciple told others that she had sex with Desai because he told her it was a gift and privilege, he denied her story. And the denial was accepted by the community, even by the woman's husband and son, who remained at the ashram after she left. Another woman came forward, and this time Desai admitted both affairs, made a public apology, and resigned. His students were outraged, heartbroken, and demoralized. The man who had carried their image of the divine had violated the moral code he imposed on them. And as the projection of his infallibility cracked, long-buried resentment surfaced and the community fractured. In his traditional Indian guru role, Desai responded by trying to teach surrender and selfless service. Later, Kripalu staff brought in a diverse group of therapists and consultants to assist them to resolve emotional issues that years of yoga practice had left untouched in the shadow. The community was reorganized in a more egalitarian way, with a council of residents and payment for individual service. Desai learned about projection and came to understand that his model didn't address early childhood wounds around abuse, authority, and self-expression. He said, "I'm determined to use the failure of the dream as an opportunity to enter into an authentic relationship. We're dismantling the old form, and I'm letting go of my attachment to the parental role, my self-concept. I'm exploring how to blend yoga with psychotherapy to create a new model. If you have conflict with me and I blame you, that goes under the carpet. And it waits there until someone else pushes the button and the same fear comes back. And that's why my determination is to face everything." Unquote. So this is a rare example of a teacher trying to be accountable and engage communal shadow work with the community. Individual members are supported in their healing and systems are reorganized. I believe he eventually left. He doesn't run Kripalu anymore. And I don't know who does, but I know that it was reimagined in this process. In another example in my book, you can read about the LA Zen Center following scandals of sexual abuse by its male roshi. And the female roshi who took over revamped everything, the power dynamics, the communication style, even the practices. It's another example of systemic change as a result of the discovery of sexual abuse by a teacher. So what can the individual do? At some point, a follower or believer can no longer tolerate being the subject of shaming or sexual violence. She can no longer tolerate being the witness of hypocrisy or coercion. The moments of choice kind of come and go as she calculates her risks of staying, her risks of leaving. And it's a tense, painful period filled with fear and confusion for people. Whether this is in a church, synagogue, sangha, or zendo. If she can break through denial and really begin self-reflection, Here are some questions to start the journey. Reflect on your role in relation to your teacher. Are you obedient, dependent, childlike, repeating family patterns? You feel more free and authentic, or more trapped and controlled? Can you feel a tension between your devotion and your individuality, a need for autonomy? What did you give away in projection to your idealized other? What qualities did he or she carry for you? And as a result, what did you banish into your own shadow? Have you given away your light, your spiritual essence? Have you projected your spiritual authority? What do you attribute to the teacher and disown in yourself? I'm going to just pause after each of these so you have a moment. And what about our beliefs? Have you projected your certainty and banished your doubts to buy into a belief system? Have you accepted others' definitions of moral behavior and spirituality? And what do you need in order to reclaim your critical thinking? Which of your beliefs need to be questioned now? Which of your images of the divine no longer serve you? And if you're in later life, how are your spiritual beliefs affecting your feelings about who you are now? And how do they affect your feelings about your mortality? So we need to do self-reflection about our feelings as well. Have you cultivated a spiritual persona that narrows your range of feeling? Maybe you banished anger or sexuality or grief. What's your biggest fear of reclaiming your feelings? That they're unspiritual, that they will lead you to act in a certain way. And what do you need to feel safe to reclaim those feelings? And how about reclaiming the body? We know that most religious and spiritual traditions, especially the monastic ones, really split the body, mind, spirit. Do you believe the impulses of the body are dangerous temptations? And which sensations have you forbidden? And what would happen if you began to allow them to arise? What do you need to feel safe for that? So if we have sacrificed our capacity to question authority and think critically, our capacity to feel deeply and honor those feelings, our capacity to detect bodily cues and messages, to sense our own spiritual power, then we'll become passive, submissive, even childlike. And we won't be able to leave an abusive discipleship. We won't be able to shift from victim to bystander to whistleblower. So how can you break through denial and reclaim your own agency? Your capacity to act as an independent, clear-thinking person in your own behalf or on behalf of others. What do you need to separate from an abusive relationship or community? So with the collapse of projections, the real inner work begins. We can see through our projections to the humanity in the other, his darkness and light, her fallibility and divinity. And slowly we've come to see that our beloved guide, mentor, analyst, or guru is not responsible for carrying the divine for us. We recognize that what they carried for us was inside of us all along. And as we begin to do spiritual shadow work and reclaim our projections, we can carry our own wounds and our own greatness. We need others in a different way, not to parent us, not to connect us to the divine, but to join us in the dance between love and freedom, union and autonomy. The promise of spiritual shadow work is different for different people. Some people will leave a teacher or community but continue a practice. Others will stay and help to reimagine a healthier model. But the holy longing for union with the divine fuels the evolution of consciousness, and the reality of spiritual awakening awaits. A fortunate few find the narrow path through the darkness and undergo an initiation. We travel from spiritual innocence through the dark descent toward a new level of consciousness, spiritual maturity. We evolve from dependency on a spiritual parent through meeting the shadow toward spiritual adulthood. Having been emptied out of old ideas and images, we become fertile soil for new life. Open, but not naive. Eager, but not impatient. And with practice, we learn to meet the darkness in ourselves and in our teachers. coming to accept it as a part of being human, but no longer susceptible to its abuse. We may be able to see some of our own shadow, accept our limitations, and empathize more deeply with others. For some, this inner work requires separation from the teacher, and for others, it requires becoming a whistleblower. But in the end, shadow work for spiritual abuse requires that we reclaim lost parts of the self and permit new feelings and images to emerge. It requires that we reclaim all that was sacrificed as a projection onto an idealized other, because our capacity to carry our own greatness was so diminished. This is the completion of spiritual unfinished business. I'm calling for a reimagination of religious and spiritual life that expands to include the human shadow. It's not absent in anyone. It's not going anywhere. It's a part of the path and of the human journey. But it's also not the whole story. The human soul's longing for transcendence, awakening, the divine beloved, the higher self, is the central mystery of a human life. To follow our longing, we need to ask, what is spiritual integrity? To me, it means living with the awareness of our interdependence with all life. So the need for compassion for all living things. If we don't have the direct experience of that interconnection, we can hold the knowledge of it and act accordingly. Individually, this includes inner work on our own moral development, which is neglected often in spiritual communities. It includes speaking and behaving with honesty and transparency, not secrecy. It includes living with congruence. We do what we say, not hypocrisy. It includes personal shadow awareness, taking responsibility when our shadows act out. This is the dance of darkness and light in our search for awakening. And I want to close now by opening an invitation to each of you, if you're interested in reading this book in community and doing spiritual shadow work together. You can send me an email, conniezweig@gmail.com. Put spiritual shadow work in the subject line and send me your time zone. I've organized hundreds of groups now between the last book and this book all over the world. They're free, they're leaderless, and they're organized by time zone so that you can all meet conveniently on Zoom or another platform. And you can go through this book together and share your own stories and build safety and intimacy. And I will send guidelines for each group when it starts. So thank you. I'm going to stop the share and come back to you now. Okay. So do any of you resonate with this experience that I'm describing and have questions or comments, additions or subtractions to anything I said? Yeah?
Hi, Connie. I don't exactly know how to put this into words or a framework. I come from a Jungian background, a long, deep, profound Jungian background. My husband was a Jungian analyst, and the shadow is always extremely important. And the amount of material that you put forward in this short span of time is pretty enormous. You know, it's a lot to take in. And I know that when I'm in groups where the shadow work comes up, it's a challenge to be able to bring it down and decipher it in a way that the average person can grasp and understand. And I'm wondering if you could give some examples, perhaps, that the common issues that come up in people's lives, because I find that it's hard for people to grasp the whole idea of the shadow, that something is wrong with them, and if you tap into it, they get very defensive and like, oh no, so to make it palatable in a way that they can accept it and say, yeah, so we all have a shadow, we all cast a shadow, nobody is free from having a shadow, which makes it a lot easier. Excuse me. But
Okay.
anyway, with that,
what I'm hearing you ask a more general question, not so much about spirituality.
yeah.
Yeah, so which is not really what this event was about. So, Meeting the Shadow, which came out in 1981, I think, is an anthology of different experts talking about the shadow in different fields of life. And then Romancing the Shadow, which I wrote in the 90s, is much more addressing what you're talking about, how we meet the shadow in everyday life. So, and how to work with it. So that's where I developed this method of shadow work, was in Romancing the Shadow. So, we meet the shadow in our dreams. I can say that to you. Yes. When we have a dream character that's very different from our ego identity. We have a thief, or we have someone who's doing something destructive or self-destructive in the dream, but it's our dream. So it's a part of us that we're meeting there.
Right.
We meet a shadow in a projection that's an exaggerated feeling about somebody we really don't know. We go to a party, we meet a stranger, and we have an intense, exaggerated response. There's some kind of shadow projection going on there. We meet a shadow when we say something impulsively that surprises us, and then we say, oh God, that's not who I am. Why did I say that? We meet a shadow when we have the same repetitive fight with our partner and we can't figure out what's going on. Maybe it's a critic. Maybe it's a distancer. Maybe it's when we struggle with an addiction or compulsion of some kind. That's a part of the shadow. So the shadow is this infinitely deep and complex part of life. It's not a little corner in the brain, right? Because we know that the brain, mind, body is all interconnected. And we know a lot more about that now than Jung did at his time. And so there's shadow material in our bodies, in our nerves, in our muscles, in our feelings, in our thoughts. So what I did is, because this is so kind of amorphous and abstract, what I tried to do was help people find one particular aspect of their shadow, which I call a shadow character, and learn how to identify that shadow character. Because what I discovered when I was writing Romancing the Shadow is that every time that shadow character comes up, you have the same inner dialogue. You say the same thing to yourself. I have to have that ice cream. Where's that? I need that ice cream now. And the feelings that go with that and the sensations that go with that are always the same. So then you learn how to identify the foodie, or whatever you call it. You give it a name, you give it an image, and then you have all these cues. And what was unconscious before can move into your awareness, sometimes only for an instant before you open the freezer. Sometimes only for an instant, but there it is. Oh, it's the foodie. And then you have a moment of choice, whether to obey that shadow character or not. Or let's say you're in the habit of criticizing your husband. I'll say husband because there's more women than men here. So let's say you're in the habit of that. And you recognize the critic and you start attuning, you start self-reflecting. Oh, there's that inner dialogue. I wish he did this. Why isn't he like that? And then there's the feelings that go with that. And then there's the sensations. If you're more kinesthetic, you turn into the body. And then you know the critic is coming up. And you can pause and ask yourself, do I want to criticize him right now? I know the consequences of that shadow character acting out. He'll be hurt. There'll be distance. There'll be a fight, right? Now, what I've found was, and then you learn how to trace the shadow character back in your history to see when it formed. And you discover a lot about it, why it's there, when it formed, what it's a defense against. And also, it has valid needs. So often the valid need in the critic that I discovered is it needs space. That person needs distance. But the shadow is creating distance in a hurtful way. Instead of just saying, you know what, honey, I need a night to myself. And not pushing him away with the criticism. So one of the real benefits of this is you learn to respond more consciously, communicate more consciously, instead of this unconscious material erupting all the time and leading to self-sabotage. So you can identify if you're doing any kind of self-sabotaging behavior, whatever it is, that's a shadow. It's hard to say the shadow. There's the shadow, it's like this giant thing, and then there's shadow content, and there's shadow characters, right? And there's these figures that show up in dreams. I mean, Thea, it's a lot. So what I'm trying to do with this new book, so The Inner Work of Age, was about extending shadow work into midlife and beyond for people who want to look at the unconscious process around aging. And when I went into my late 60s and started to think about retirement, I couldn't find anything about Jung or the unconscious and aging. There was not a single book. So I started to research that and discovered a lot of material that was about internalized ageism. And so the shadow character is called the inner ageist. And that inner ageist is giving us particular messages about how we look and what we do and how we feel. And that requires shadow work, because if you don't become conscious of the inner ageist, you end up feeling really badly about yourself. You end up, with self-loathing and shame about aging. And then the doer. So the doer is the part of us that in our midlife journeys gives us a really good life to build a foundation, a family, a business, right? But when we retire and we really need or want to slow down, the doer becomes a shadow figure. So how do we work with that? I'm in the midst of that now. That's why I put that in my bio, shifting from role to soul, because I'm shifting my identity from the doer, from what I do, to who I really am. So this new book is about the unconscious and religion or spirituality. And I tried to, it's an update from a very earlier book, post Me Too, everything that we've learned in the culture, and also all of the terrible scandals that are happening now all over the world. Unbelievable. I mean, I got seriously disturbed and upset writing this book because I found people who were supposed to be enlightened acting out their shadows. How do you make sense of that? If that's true, then what is enlightenment? If that's true, then what is awakening? What is spiritual awakening? And so I wrestled with some of these ideas that I hadn't seen that material anywhere. I couldn't find stuff for myself to read about it. So that was why I wrote that book.
Connie, I have a question.
Yeah.
Has there been any research done on the childhoods of abusive spiritual leaders? What influence, what shadow were they suppressing from their childhood?
Gloria, I don't know that there's a general statement to make, but I can tell you I recently saw, I think it was on YouTube, there was a Tibetan Buddhist teacher named Kalu Rinpoche. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. You've heard of him, Thea? He was like a Buddha. I mean, you sit in the room with him, he was empty. He was amazing. Then he died, and this young man came from Tibet, and they recognized him as the reincarnation of Kalu Rinpoche. I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist, but that's how that works in that lineage. And so he was given that name, and he came to the West, and he has been talking about how many boys are sexually molested in those monasteries. So, and I don't know if any of you saw the news out of Poland, that Polish Catholic diocese where the priests were having an orgy with a male prostitute. Did you see that last week?
No.
All these Catholic priests were having an orgy with this male prostitute. So were those guys molested when they were young? Seems likely. Maybe not all of them, maybe some of them.
Yeah.
Maybe they're, because they may be gay and celibate, that's part of this. I think celibacy is so much of the issue in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I think so too.
So I don't know. I can only give you like a handful of cases. I don't really know generally. When I wrote that chapter, I kind of thought I was going to find a lot of narcissism. That didn't surprise me, the lack of empathy and the self-centeredness. But I think some of these people are sociopaths. I mean, I had to go there for myself to try to make sense of what I was finding.
Yeah.
So how does that happen? I mean,
Yeah. Well, you do mention in the book a couple of instances of religious leaders being very isolated in their childhoods and growing up. And I recently read a book by Steve Taylor called Disconnected. And it's not about spiritual leaders, it's about leaders, political CEOs, that kind of thing. And he says that a common denominator between, like, let's see, Stalin and Hitler and Franco and Mussolini and Donald Trump, that they all had similar childhoods where they had kind of an oppressive, authoritarian father and a mother who was either physically or emotionally unavailable, and how that creates an emptiness that needs to be filled, kind of like the hungry ghost thing. But so they crave power. And because they crave power, and this could apply to some spiritual leaders as well. So I was just wondering if any of that research has been done.
Because in some ways, the people you named were spiritual leaders. Mm-hmm. Because they created cult-like followings with blind faith in order to exact their control over people. which is exactly what Trump, I mean, I've often wondered what Trump's childhood was like. I think his niece talks about it sometimes.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
He definitely fit that model. He had a very kind of authoritarian father, very critical, and distant, and a mother who he never talks about his mother, So I don't want to get political, but this is, just something that I think it would be good if it were studied more, because for instance, in this book about the leaders, he talks about how in indigenous cultures, they choose their leaders based on what the person they think can do the right thing, can do best. And they don't have them elected, and anyone in many of these indigenous cultures that he mentions, if anyone shows signs of craving power, wanting power, they are completely disqualified. And so maybe there should be a little bit more of a screening process before. And as you mentioned, why isn't shadow work done in these, ashrams and spiritual centers of all kinds?
Well, there's no psychology at all. I mean, there's a split in our world between spirituality, religion, and psychology. So it's there are recent thinkers like Ken Wilber who have really taken that on and tried to integrate the fields, transpersonal psychology in the 1970s. But now that's all with Wilber and integral psychology. But there's in the common parlance, there's very little connection. There's separate silos. And I think, I think a lot of the mental illness that we see now is some of it is a reflection of the failure of psychology to really kind of make a stake in the world, put down a stake, really take enough credit and have enough influence. I remember when the first time Trump ran, there were all these psychiatrists writing about it and freaking out. And now I don't see that at all.
Right.
So, it's a scary moment. And in the religious or spiritual arena, there's very little consequence. And so some people have left the country, like Bikram had to leave the country, I think, one of the messages I want to say here is it's not all bad. This is not all good, all bad thinking. It's not black and white thinking, right? I'm not saying that there's no value in these teachings and in these practices, because some people have tremendous spiritual breakthroughs and, find real value in the transmissions of these teachers, even the teachers who act out, like Trungpa Rinpoche, who was one of the worst. But when I talk to people, they got so much meaning and beauty and, so this is not a book about cults and telling everybody they have to get out and go back into conventional society. This is not about that. This is really about inner work and becoming aware of what you're giving away in relation to experts or mentors or guides. I mentioned analysts because you told me, Gloria, that there were some analysts. That can happen too. And in the professional magazines for psychologists and MFTs, we see, in every magazine, all these people who are acting out money and sex in their clinical work. So this is not just in one arena, politics or religion. This is human nature. And
well, you mentioned about Trungpa Rinpoche, and he would be a good example of someone, and you write about this in quite a lot of detail in your book, someone who was enlightened, but as Ken Wilber says, we have to distinguish between a stage and a state, right? So he must have had states of enlightenment. He had tremendous wisdom, you know. I never knew him or met him, but I've heard about him, and yet not all of our levels of consciousness, whether, you know, it's spiritual, psychological, mental, emotional, you know, they don't all evolve together. So
right.
A person can have, as you state in your book, can have tremendous, you know, ability to convey spiritual truth, but they've never worked with their shadow, or they have, you know, issues, emotional issues that they addressed. And so it becomes, you know, you have to look at the whole package, right? But because a lot of the students are projecting all their own light on this person, they don't see that. They only see what they, you know, what they long for. And I love your chapter on the holy longing. It's a beautiful chapter.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go to Thea. She's been waving me down.
Oh, okay. Unless somebody else has a question. Okay, but I don't see anyone else's hand up, so go ahead, Thea.
Yeah, what I wanted to say, first of all, is Trungpa Rinpoche. He lived his shadow. That's what. I mean, are you aware of that, Connie?
He what?
He lived his shadow. People would be so upset with him, so angry at him, you know, because he did outrageous things.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because he still had that tremendous following. But what I wanted to say is, so I think he's a good example of somebody who accepts his shadow, you know?
Yeah, I don't see it that way, but go ahead.
Right. Okay. The other thing I want to say is that when I think of the shadow, I think of the fact that we, as humans, we're living in this dualistic realm of existence, you know, duality, and that each of us, in some way or another, through life, we identify with our ego or whatever it is in life that we might identify with, and that can serve us really well, or it could be that the opposite. That's why I bring up duality, that there's the opposite factor that is at play. And so where I see this in the work I have done and been aware of is the factor of denial, that which we deny and reject in ourselves. That becomes a real shadow part.
That's right.
If we can identify that, that can be really a helpful tool in engaging that part. You know, a person
Thank you, Thea. Thank you.
Okay.
Wendy, did you want to say something? Wendy, did you want to say something?
Well, I'm going to just say that everything you've talked about, and I've never heard of shadow work until a week ago when Gloria and I were on the telephone. I'm 64 going on 65, and when I was 17, I became involved in a cult. They called it the Human Potential Movement back then. You remember?
Yes.
The 1970s. And it was the one that I got into was called EST, It's now called Landmark. It's had
Yeah.
a whole thing. And I couldn't begin to, talk about everything with a little time. And I do intend to email you about continuing this. What I'm taking from what you're saying is that the shadow character is pretty much in all of us. Our own shadow character and that of the teachers or mentors or parents or friends or whoever is that.
Well, what I'm saying, Wendy, is that the way that we're built as children, the part of us that's approved of and encouraged goes into the ego, our conscious personality. The part of us that's disapproved of, rejected, devalued, denied, goes into the unconscious shadow. And so the ego and the shadow develop in tandem. And it's inevitable. Nobody gets away without it.
Right.
It's an inevitable developmental process.
Right.
But the shadow characters, those parts that we can actually work with the method, are different in different people.
Of course.
I mean, some people have a critic that's like this, and some have a critic that's like that. Of course. But those are different in different people. I want to respond to Maria's in the chat. So, there's, we talked about shadow projection from individual onto an individual, but there's also collective shadow projection, which is at the root of many of our issues today. Anti-immigrant shadow projection, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism. These are examples of collective shadow projection, ageism. So, this happens, our individual shadows are embedded in family shadows, which are embedded in groups, community shadows, which are embedded in our national shadow. And they're all interconnected. Jung wrote about the collective unconscious. So, but I think I'm just going to close now, unless anybody has an urgent comment to make. I thank you all. Thank you all for having me.
Okay, thank you.
And please, feel free, if you want a book study group to do spiritual shadow work in community, you can email me, conniezweig@gmail.com, and be sure to let me know your time zone. Please don't send me a long story, because I get hundreds of emails every day. Just, the fact that you want the group and what is your time zone, and I'd be happy to connect you with people. Gloria, thank you for this opportunity. It's much appreciated. And I send you all love.